Damaged Defenders by Scherzer. Chapter 37. Betty. It had taken Betty a few days to truly acclimate to her new circumstances. She'd gotten so used to being wary, suspicious, and afraid while in Cheyenne Mountain. She'd gotten used to looking over her shoulder waiting for the general's next attack. Oh, we hadn't laid a hand on her physically, but the last year had been a non-stop war of words. The general had stopped by her quarters or the lab at least once a day. He constantly harped on how she should be thankful to him for keeping her safe and arranging for gainful employment. When he wasn't harping on about that, it was all about how the creature was a vicious, unstoppable monster that would kill her as soon as look at her. Betty had lost track of the number of times she'd wanted to break the general's jaw. Betty hadn't quite believed Rhodey was on the level when he showed up. True, he was Air Force and not Army, but she wouldn't put it past the general to have that sort of reach and be testing her while he was out trying to collect Bruce. Honestly, she hadn't quite believed the situation was what it was until she'd been wrapped up in Bruce's arms. She didn't think anyone would blame her and Bruce for being very clingy since they'd been reunited. They'd barely been anywhere other than their floor and the lab, and always together, always within line of sight of each other. Betty had been startled and amused by the number of defenders Bruce had accumulated in a matter of days. The entirety of the Avengers had come solidly down on Bruce's side of the fight in an apparently unbeatable combination of political, monetary, physical, and ironically enough, military power that the general couldn't seem to breach. Fully half of them had gone to bat for Bruce personally. Betty strongly suspected that the ones that hadn't merely hadn't been afforded the opportunity yet. She was also fairly certain that Natasha and Clint had come up with some sort of plan to deal with the general, provided Tony didn't get there first. Betty had finally begun to relax in the last day or so. She still wanted to be near Bruce, but that had more to do with her loving him and wanting to be with him than it did a fear he'd be taken from her again. Bruce, too, seemed to be relaxing a bit. He got on with Tony like a house on fire, which seemed to be helping. It was rather hard to keep worrying about the general when they were trying to keep up with Tony. Betty had never seen someone quite like him. He came off as scatterbrained, jumping from one thing to the next in conversations, but Betty had quickly realized it wasn't scatterbrained at all. Tony had a startling ability to multitask on a level she'd never seen. He was rarely involved in less than 3 things at any one time. Some combinations of one or more conversations with people in the room, phone conversations, using a Stark pad or his lab equipment, and frequent asides and instructions to Jarvis and or his lab bots. The fact that Tony had been willing to go to war for Bruce had predisposed Betty to like the man. When she'd found out he'd been so totally blasé about the Hulk, she'd been strongly tempted to adopt him out of sheer gratitude. Being willing to fight for Bruce's right to freedom was completely different from not fearing Hulk. Certainly Steve, Thor, Loki, and Logan had been as blasé, but those 4 were at the very least far more durable than a normal human. Today, she and Bruce were puttering around their lab. They'd begun collaborating with Jane on certain aspects of the Rainbow Bridge project, since they were more familiar with gamma radiation in specific than Jane was. They knew that Asgard had the Tesseract, and were now in the process of rebuilding the broken section of their bridge and the control station they used to travel. Jane wanted to build a similar station somewhere on Earth so that they could travel to the other 9 realm worlds without having to go to Asgard first. While they helped with that, Bruce had gotten the idea for an Earth-based transporter because the bridge was basically an interdimensional transporter. Simplifying the bridge and making it much shorter range would make Star Trek-style transporters a reality. They were so engrossed in their project that Betty jumped when Jarvis spoke up. "Forgive me for the interruption, but I have a call for you, Dr. Banner, from the President," Jarvis said. Bruce almost instantly went green around the gills, but not in a Hulk-out imminent way. This was pure nerves. Betty immediately walked over and leaned against his side. Easy, Bruce. Jarvis doesn't sound pissed off, so I don't think this is bad news. You know Jarvis has been screening calls. It had started as pure self-defense against all the paparazzi, fans, and crazies that had flooded the tower phone lines trying to get a hold of one or another of the Avengers. Shortly after the battle, it had morphed to protecting several of their number from unpleasant confrontations. Steve needed protection as there'd been a very loud sector of the population that had been very pissed off about some faker taking up the captain's mantle. Thor and Tony had come under fire from certain sectors because of their titular god status. As a result, it had become the rule that Jarvis ran interference for them and, if necessary, routed the goal to Tony, who relished crossing swords with assholes of any description. Betty had heard rumor that Loki had helped once or twice, tangling the caller up in their own rhetoric so badly they ended up espousing the viewpoint diametrically opposite to the one they'd started the call with. Silver tongue indeed. In the last couple of days, such calls had reduced in number as the media campaign Pepper had penetrated the collective consciousness of the public. There would always be those that thought Steve was a fake, or that Thor and Tony were heretical abominations. But the campaigns seemed to have started convincing the less rabid folks they were in error. "Put him through, Jarvis," Bruce said, threading his fingers through Betty's for moral support. "Dr. Banner, Dr. Ross," the president greeted them both. "I will get right to the point, as I am aware that your time is quite valuable. I have signed a series of documents in regards to Dr. Banner. One is a pardon for previous incidents of damage by Dr. Banner's alter ego. The second is an order that forbids coercing, hunting, or capturing Dr. Banner or his alter ego for any military or scientific purpose. The third forbids any attempt to arrest, capture, or litigate Dr. Banner or his alter ego for future damage done in defense of himself, this country, or the planet. In short, Dr. Banner, in future, if an American attempts to mess with you for any reason, they're going to end up in jail for a very, very long time." Bruce seemed to be beyond words. Betty stared at the screen for a long time before she managed to regain a sense of equilibrium. "Why now?" she wanted to know. "Don't get me wrong, Mr. President. This is very appreciated. But why now and not years ago?" "Dr. Banner's initial transformation took place before I came into office, so I cannot speak for my predecessor," the president said. "As for myself, I can only say that the situation was presented to me in such a way that containing Dr. Banner's alter ego seemed like a good idea. It has been borne in upon me in the last 2 days that containing his alter ego is apparently impossible, and coercing it is, if not impossible, then exceedingly unwise. I have also been informed that every incident of the Hulk's appearance, save the Harlem incident and his latest appearance, was a result of Dr. Banner being chased about by the army. I've been informed that Hulk was actually trying to help in Harlem, and obviously the other day, and that if Dr. Banner had been left alone, there would not have been a problem the other times. It seems common sensible to encourage people to leave Dr. Banner alone, in light of those facts." Betty thought about that for a moment before she nodded. "All right." "You should also know that General Ross has been stripped of his rank and thrown into Leavenworth for the remainder of his life," the president said. "Once I was fully informed of his actions, it was very clear to me that he was overstepping himself by a very large margin, to put it mildly. He was in Leavenworth approximately 5 minutes after I was fully informed of his actions. A courier will be arriving at Stark Tower later today with copies of the documents, so that you have them on hand," the president said. Betty had always wondered about that. About why the general hadn't been thrown in jail before now. She knew it was far beyond the remit of any one general to send troops into a country for any purpose when war had not been declared with that country. The Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense were an exception to that rule, but the general had never held such a lofty position. Evidently, he managed to avoid trouble by dint of having friends that agreed with him in high enough positions to turn a blind eye and misinform the president about the situation if he took notice of the hunt. "Thank you, Mr. President," Betty said. It took a stunned Bruce a minute to recover enough to echo her thanks. "Indeed. Thank you, sir," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are very welcome, Dr. Brenner," the president said, then ended the call. Silence reigned in the lab for a few minutes before Bruce turned to her. "Did that? I didn't imagine that, did I?" he asked. "You mean the whole president making everyone back off thing? That actually happened, Bruce," Betty told him, cupping his cheek affectionately. Bruce blinked at her. "You know, I keep thinking this is all a very detailed dream, and that I'll wake up in a cage somewhere," he admitted. "You being here, a great lab, people who don't hate and fear the other guy, and now the president." Betty's heart twinged. She couldn't understand why he thought it was a dream after more than 5 years of being hunted like a rabid animal. "Oh, Bruce," she said, then kissed him gently. "Not a dream, I promise." Bruce let out a shaky laugh as he wrapped an arm around her. "Yeah, well, keep saying that. I might start believing it at some point." Then he smiled. "I wonder how much yelling Tony had to do to get the president to agree with him." "Actually, Dr. Banner, it is Miss Potts who got the president involved in this matter," Jarvis said. "When General Ross approached the tower last time, she called him and provided him with the relevant data." Bruce laughed. "I must admit, I'm beginning to see why Tony is so enthralled with her." Betty gave him a mock-injured look. "Oh, really?" Bruce grinned. "Don't worry, Betty. She's not a patch on you," he said. "But I can see the appeal. She's fierce and isn't afraid to play dirty to get things done." And Betty knew that Tony thoroughly approved of playing dirty to get things done. If he didn't, he wouldn't have built the armor to kick the Ten Rings collective ass, nor would he have forced peace on the war-torn Middle East in retaliation of being kidnapped and having his weapons being used on American soldiers. That mindset had existed for Tony pre-kidnapping. Why else would he have created the Jericho missile? That particular weapon played very, very dirty. "Well, I vote we wrap up early and celebrate," Betty said. "A little wine, a nice meal." She trailed off and gave Bruce a wicked grin. Bruce wasn't slow on the uptake. "That sounds really good," he agreed. They hadn't had full-on sex yet. Bruce was still wanting to go slow with that for understandable reasons. He'd gotten better control of the Hulk since they'd last seen each other, but that didn't mean his control was foolproof. Combined with how long it had been since they'd been able to be together, they'd settled for a lot of kissing, snuggling, and a little bit of foreplay, all accomplished with no problems in the last few days. Today seemed like a good time to push further. Not that they really needed an excuse, but knowing the general was in jail and no one could legally hurt him anymore would be a load off of Bruce's mind. That meant less stress, pushing him towards a Hulk out, which in turn meant he had more wiggle room to deal with emotional upheaval.